When Thomas Mitchell, the billionaire CEO most sought after in Chicago, decides to take Sarah Johnson to the prestigious annual charity gala, no one expects that the young nanny caring for his children is about to cause the biggest social scandal of the year. As the city's elite greet her with looks of disdain and cruel whispers, judging her by her simple clothes and humble background, they have no idea of the extraordinary strength hidden behind that ordinary woman. But when Sarah steps onto the stage and reveals the devastating truth about her life, her words will not only silence her critics, they will expose the deepest prejudices of high society and forever change the way an entire city sees the true worth of a person. Get ready for a night that began with malicious laughter and ended with a revelation no one saw coming.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The 11th floor of the Sterling building sliced through the Chicago sky like a blade of steel and glass. At the center of that corporate empire, Thomas Mitchell stood motionless before the wall of windows overlooking his office. His gray eyes reflected the city lights awakening on that October morning, but his mind was far away, lost in the cold numbers of reports and projections that would define the next quarter. T42. Thomas had built an empire his own parents never dreamed of. Mitchell and Associates wasn't just another financial consulting firm. It was the firm Wall Street magnates turned to when they needed miracles. Every move he made was worth millions. Every decision echoed through international markets, and every second of his time cost more than many earned in a month. But there, in the quiet morning stillness before another day of corporate battles, something bothered him. Maybe it was the hollow echo of his own breathing in that vast room. Or maybe the persistent memory of Emma asking the night before if he would be home for dinner. Again, he had answered with a maybe they both knew meant no. The intercom on his desk emitted a soft chime. "Mr. Mitchell, your first meeting is in 15 minutes," announced Rebecca, his assistant, with the precision of a Swiss watch. "Thank you, Rebecca." His voice came out rougher than he intended, weighed down by an exhaustion that 3 cups of coffee couldn't lift. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Catherine left, taking not just her presence but all the lightness in his life. Cancer had consumed her in months, transforming a vibrant woman into a memory he locked deep in his heart, far from where it could hurt him during work hours. Emma was only 5 when she lost her mother. Lucas, even younger, barely remembered her now. Thomas knew he should fill that void. But how? How could a man who spent 16 hours a day buried in spreadsheets and negotiations offer the kind of love a mother gave naturally? The answer came 2 years ago, in the form of Sarah Johnson. At that moment, 16 floors below and 8 blocks away, Sarah knelt on the kitchen floor of the Mitchell house, helping Lucas tie the laces of his little blue sneakers. The golden morning light filtered through white linen curtains, creating a warm atmosphere that sharply contrasted with the corporate cold Thomas breathed daily. "Like this, Lucas. See? Make a little loop here, then go under." Her voice had a natural sweetness that made even the simplest tasks seem like exciting adventures. Lucas, 6 years old, with unruly brown hair just like his dad's, looked intently at his own feet, his tongue peeking out the corner of his mouth as he followed her instructions. "I did it, Sarah. I did it." "Of course you did, champ." Sarah smiled, and it was impossible not to feel warmed by that genuine expression. At 28, she had a simple beauty that required no frills. Light brown hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail, green eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a presence that could make any place feel like home. Emma burst into the kitchen, her pink backpack bouncing on her back. Sarah, today's the butterfly presentation day. Will you be here when I get home to tell me how it went?" Sarah's heart tightened slightly. As always, she wasn't sure if she'd be around when Emma came back. Thomas had a habit of creating emergency meetings, last-minute trips, appointments that popped up out of nowhere and required her to stay late or sometimes to miss the next day altogether. "I'll do everything I can to be here, sweetheart. And you're going to rock that presentation. I'm sure of it." Emma smiled, but there was a shadow of uncertainty in her brown eyes. The same eyes as Thomas, but infinitely more expressive. "Do you think Daddy will be able to pick me up today?" Sarah felt that familiar squeeze in her chest. How many times had she comforted Emma after another fatherly absence? How many times had she had to make up excuses to explain why Thomas couldn't be there for important moments? Your dad is working really hard to take care of both of you, she said gently, brushing a stray lock from Emma's hair. But I'm sure he thinks of you all the time. A lie? Sarah knew Thomas Mitchell hardly had time to think about anything but charts and reports. She'd seen him come home at 10 at night, go straight to his office, and leave before the kids even woke up the next morning. Some days, he seemed more like a ghost living in that house than a father. But she'd also seen him in rare, unguarded moments. Like that night, 3 weeks ago, when she arrived home early and found Lucas running a fever. Thomas had stayed up all night, taking the boy's temperature every hour. The mask of the ruthless executive completely melted away by paternal worry, or like last week, when Emma had a nightmare and ran to her dad's office. Sarah had peeked from the stairs and seen Thomas holding her daughter in his arms, whispering softly as he stroked her hair until she fell back asleep. He wasn't a cold man. He was a scared man, afraid to get too close and lose again, afraid to love and have that love ripped away by life's cruelty. "Good morning, Thomas." Dr. Harrison Reynolds extended his hand, and Thomas shook it with the automatic firmness of someone who greets dozens of people a day. But today, the meeting with the city's charitable board carried a different weight. "Harrison, how is Margaret?" "Very well, thank you. Looking forward to the gala as always." Harrison smiled with the pride of a man still in love with his wife after 30 years of marriage. "And you? Have you decided who will be your date this year?" Thomas felt the muscles in his neck tighten slightly. The Chicago Annual Charity Gala was more than a social event. It was practically an obligation for men in his position. A parade of power, influence, and inevitably, speculation about his personal life. For the past 2 years, he'd attended alone, facing pitying looks and whispers about the poor widower who couldn't move on. Single women of Chicago society surrounded him like birds of prey, each convinced she would be the one to break the ice around the city's most desired CEO's heart. "I haven't decided yet," he lied, because the truth was, he hadn't even thought about it until that moment. "Well, you know you're always welcome to join our table. Margaret is organizing a lovely group this year." Thomas nodded vaguely, his mind already drifting away. He knew exactly what Margaret Reynolds considered lovely. A succession of perfectly polished socialites, all with impressive resumes and personalities that somehow managed to be both sophisticated and boring at the same time. The meeting dragged on for 2 more hours, discussing budgets, schedules, and the VIP guest list. Thomas participated mechanically, his signature authorizing checks that would change thousands of lives. But his mind stayed oddly restless. When he finally got home that afternoon, surprisingly early, it was only 6 o'clock. Thomas paused at the kitchen door. Sarah was helping Emma with her homework at the oak table, while Lucas played with building blocks on the floor. The golden fall light streamed through the windows, creating an atmosphere that screamed family, home warmth. Something stirred in Thomas's chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. "Daddy!" Lucas dropped the blocks and ran to him, wrapping his legs around Thomas's knees with the strength of a tiny hurricane. "Hey, champ!" Thomas lifted the boy, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of his son in his arms. For a moment, he let himself relax. He let himself simply be a dad. "Daddy, you're home early." Emma got up from the table, her face bright with a pure joy that squeezed Thomas's heart. "I managed to finish work early today." Another lie. He had simply left, leaving a pile of reports on his desk and Rebecca with a list of excuses for anyone who called. Sarah stood as well, smiling with that warm expression that always made Thomas slightly uncomfortable. Not because it wasn't genuine, quite the opposite. It was too genuine, too real, too human for the world of facades he lived in. "What a nice surprise," she said, and Thomas noticed how her presence made everything feel more alive. "The kids were talking earlier about how much they missed you." A silence settled, one heavy with unspoken things. Thomas really looked at Sarah, maybe for the first time in 2 years. She wore faded jeans and a simple blue blouse, had a pencil tucked behind her ear, and a yellow paint smudge on her cheek, probably from some art project with Lucas. She was the complete opposite of the women he usually dealt with in the corporate world. She didn't wear high heels or tailored suits. She didn't talk about investments or market trends. She didn't pretend to be interested in conversations that were really just disguised negotiations. Sarah Johnson talked about butterflies and shoelaces. She made pancakes that made the kitchen smell like a real home. She knew every song that made Emma and Lucas laugh until they couldn't breathe. And the kids loved her. More than that, they flourished in her presence in a way Thomas knew he couldn't provide. "Sarah," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. "May I talk to you for a moment?" She blinked, clearly startled. "Sure, Mr. Mitchell." How long had she been calling him Mr. Mitchell? Since day one, 2 years ago. Respectful, professional, keeping exactly the distance he had unknowingly set. Thomas motioned toward the garden. Outside. Sarah followed him through the glass door to the small backyard patio. The October air was crisp, filled with the scent of dry leaves and the promise of approaching winter. The trees in the yard had started to change colors, creating a golden-red mosaic Catherine had always loved. "The kids seem to be adjusting well to school," Thomas began, unsure where he was going with the conversation. "They are. Emma's becoming a little scientist. Yesterday she explained the butterfly life cycle to me with details I didn't even know. And Lucas? Well, Lucas is learning to be more independent. Today he tied his shoes by himself for the first time." Thomas smiled involuntarily. "I didn't know that." The words hung between them, heavy with a weight neither wanted to acknowledge. How many other first times had he missed? How many small yet meaningful milestones of his children went unnoticed because he was too busy building a financial future for them, forgetting to be present in the moment? "Sarah," he said again, this time with something different in his voice, a vulnerability she'd never heard before. Do you have plans for next Saturday?" She blinked, clearly confused by the seemingly random question. "Saturday? No, not that I remember. Why? Do you need me to watch the kids?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture totally out of sync with his always in control executive image. What the hell was he doing? Was he actually considering? "Actually, no," he said, his voice growing steadier as a completely insane idea began to form in his mind. "The annual charity gala is next Saturday." "Well, it's an important event. For the company, for the city." Sarah nodded, still clearly not understanding where he was headed. "Yes, I saw it in the papers. It looks very elegant." "Yeah." Thomas stopped, took a deep breath, and wondered if he was about to make the biggest professional mistake of his career, or the smartest thing he'd done in years. "Sarah, I would like you to go with me." The words hung in the air like autumn leaves about to fall, and Sarah felt as if the world had stopped for a few seconds. Her green eyes widened, and she blinked several times, as if trying to process whether she had really heard what she thought she heard. What?" The voice came out as a whisper, filled with such genuine disbelief that it made Thomas realize his question was even more unexpected than he had imagined. Silence stretched between them in the small courtyard, filled only by the distant sound of children playing next door and the soft creak of the old oak branches shading the garden. Sarah ran her hand through her loose hair, a nervous gesture that made some strands escape her ponytail. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't understand." Her voice trembled slightly, and Thomas could see the conflict unfolding in her expressive eyes. "Are you asking me to go with you to the charity gala?" "I am," Thomas confirmed, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. Now that the words were spoken, he couldn't imagine why he hadn't thought of it before. "I know it might seem strange, but—" "Strange?" Sarah let out a nervous laugh, bringing her hands to her face. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm the nanny. I don't belong to that kind of event. I don't even know how to properly hold a champagne glass, let alone what to say to senators and businesspeople." Thomas stepped forward, and there was something in his expression Sarah had never seen before. A determination mixed with what could only be described as genuine affection. "Sarah, you've taken care of my children for 2 years. You love them as if they were your own, and they love you back. Emma talks about you constantly, and Lucas, well, sometimes I think he trusts you more than me." His voice softened, carrying an honesty he rarely let slip. "If anyone deserves to be at that event, celebrating causes that make a difference in people's lives, It's you. Sarah felt tears welling up, but she shook her head vigorously. But Mr. Mitchell, I don't have anything to wear. My entire wardrobe costs less than one of your ties. And people will stare. They'll question. They'll wonder what a woman like me is doing next to someone like you. A woman like you? Thomas frowned, genuinely puzzled. What kind of woman are you, Sarah? The question caught her off guard. Sarah opened and closed her mouth a few times before she could answer, her voice small and vulnerable. An ordinary woman, who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Austin, who finished college with a student loan she's still paying off, who drives a 10-year-old Honda Civic and whose biggest luxury is buying the most expensive coffee at the grocery store. She took a deep breath, as if each word was a weight she needed to lift off her chest. A woman who's never been to an event that costs more than her annual salary. Thomas was silent for a long moment, watching her with an intensity that made Sarah feel naked and exposed. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more intimate than she had ever heard it. Sarah, you're the woman who makes my children laugh every day, who turns simple meals into adventures, who knows the name of every stuffed animal Lucas has, and who managed to teach Emma not to be afraid of storms by telling stories about dancing clouds. He paused, running a hand through his hair. You're the woman who keeps this house running like a real home, not just a place we sleep between work appointments. The tears Sarah had been holding back began to stream down her cheeks, and she wiped them quickly with the back of her hand. As for the dress, Thomas continued, that's the least of our worries. What matters is that you'd be there not as my employee, but as my guest. Someone I want by my side. Sarah's heart raced at those last words. There was something in the way he said them, an implication far beyond just needing a date for a social event. I need to think, she murmured, unable to look him in the eye. This is a lot to process. Thomas nodded, understanding. Of course. You don't have to give me an answer right now. But they both knew that the conversation had changed something fundamental between them. An invisible line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next morning, Thomas's office in the Sterling building buzzed with the typical energy of a productive Tuesday. Margaret Stone, his executive secretary for 12 years, moved through the room with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, organizing documents, confirming meetings, and keeping the chaos of the outside world away from the controlled bubble that was Thomas's professional domain at T55. Margaret was more than an employee. She was the gatekeeper, the guardian of the impeccable reputation Thomas had built over the years. Her gray hair was always pulled into a perfect bun, her suits invariably dark and conservative, and her dedication to the company legendary. She knew Thomas Mitchell better than anyone in the corporate world. She knew his schedule, his preferences, his moods, and above all, how to protect his public image. Thomas, she said, entering his office with a steaming cup of coffee and a folder of urgent documents. I need to confirm the details for the gala on Saturday. The limousine's scheduled for 7, and I got 3 calls yesterday asking if you've decided on your date. Thomas looked up from the reports he was reviewing, and Margaret immediately noticed something different in his expression. There was a restlessness there, an energy she couldn't quite decode. Actually, Margaret, about that. Thomas set his pen down and leaned back in his chair. I've decided who my date will be. Margaret's eyes sparkled with professional interest. Excellent. One of the options we discussed? Senator Williams' daughter was my first choice. Very elegant and well-connected. Or maybe Victoria Ashford. She has that charity project for underprivileged kids that would fit perfectly with the event's theme. Actually, no. Thomas took a deep breath, knowing the next words would cause an earthquake in Margaret's perfectly organized world. I'm taking Sarah Johnson. The silence that followed was so complete Thomas could hear the ticking of the old clock on the opposite wall. Margaret stood motionless, the folder still in her hands, eyes fixed on his face as if trying to decipher whether she had heard what she thought she heard. Sarah Johnson? She repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. The nanny. Yes. Margaret carefully set the folder on the desk, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. When she spoke again, her voice carried that controlled tone she used when she was trying very hard not to explode. Thomas, may I ask if you've lost your mind completely? The question came out more blunt than Margaret usually allowed herself to be, but the situation was too extraordinary for usual protocols. She had spent over a decade building and protecting Thomas Mitchell's reputation, and now he was suggesting something that could destroy it all in one night. Margaret? No, Thomas. Let me speak. She leaned forward, hands resting on the desk. The charity gala isn't just a social event. It's a display of power, a demonstration of status, a stage where every move you make will be analyzed, photographed, and reported on in tomorrow's papers. Your date is not just a companion. It's a statement. Thomas remained silent, acknowledging the validity of Margaret's arguments, but also feeling a growing resistance within himself. And what statement do you think you'll be making by bringing the nanny? Margaret continued, her voice rising. Your competitors will feast on this. The gossip papers will speculate about everything, from a midlife crisis to financial troubles. Billionaire CEO takes housekeeper to the city's most exclusive event. Can you imagine the headlines? Every word Margaret said stung. Not because they weren't true, but because they echoed exactly the fears Thomas had been fighting all night. And Sarah? Margaret pushed. Do you really think you're doing her a favor? Throwing her into an environment where she'll be judged for every word, every move, every outfit choice? Where the city's most powerful women will dissect her with surgical precision. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. Sarah is stronger than you think. Maybe she is, Margaret conceded. But strength isn't the issue here. The issue is you both live in completely different worlds, and mixing those worlds publicly could have consequences neither of you are prepared to face. While Thomas dealt with the storm in his office, Sarah was in the Mitchells' kitchen, trying to focus on making lunch for the kids, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the previous night's conversation. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 15 years, watched Sarah with experienced eyes as she peeled potatoes at the sink. Dorothy had seen 3 generations of Mitchells pass through that house, including Thomas himself as a child, and she had a sixth sense for family drama. You're awfully quiet today, honey, Dorothy finally said, her voice carrying the soft southern accent she never lost despite decades in Chicago. Something on your mind? Sarah hesitated, knife suspended over the cutting board. Dorothy had always been kind to her, but there was a natural hierarchy in the house, and Sarah was never sure how much to share about matters involving Thomas. Mrs. Henderson, she began cautiously, can I ask you a strange question? Sure, dear. What is it? Have you ever been to a fancy event? Like a gala or something like that? Dorothy stopped peeling potatoes and fully turned to Sarah, eyebrows raised with curiosity. Well, not as a guest, if that's what you mean, but I've worked several. Why do you ask? Sarah felt her cheeks flush. It's just, well, Mr. Mitchell. What did Mr. Mitchell do now? Dorothy wiped her hands on the apron and stepped closer, her motherly eyes full of concern. The words came out in a nervous rush. He invited me to go with him to the charity gala on Saturday, and I don't know what to do, Mrs. Henderson. I don't belong in that world. I don't know how to act. I don't have the right clothes. And I'm sure I'll make a fool of myself and embarrass not just me but him as well. Dorothy was silent for a long moment, processing the information. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. Well, that's unexpected. It's a mistake, isn't it? Sarah slumped into a chair. It's a terrible idea. I wouldn't say it's a mistake, Dorothy answered thoughtfully. Surprising, yes, but Thomas Mitchell isn't a man who makes impulsive decisions. If he invited you, he has his reasons. Sarah looked at her with hope. You really think so? Dorothy pulled up a chair and sat beside Sarah. Honey, I've watched that man grow up, saw how he was before Catherine died. Young, passionate, full of life, and I've seen how he closed himself off after. Like he built a wall around his heart to keep from feeling pain again. Dorothy's words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. But, Dorothy continued, I've also noticed how he's been different the past few weeks. Less tense, coming home early a few times, even smiling occasionally. And the kids, well, they're happier than they have been in a long time. Do you think it's because of me? Sarah asked in a whisper. I believe, Dorothy said gently, that you've brought something to this house I never realized was missing. Warmth. Not just for the kids, but for the whole family. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes again. But Mrs. Henderson, I don't know how to behave in that world. What to say, how to act. Darling, Dorothy held her hands. You know how to be yourself. And if Thomas Mitchell invited you, it's because it's you he wants by his side, not some fake version of who you think you should be. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling something settle inside her chest. But what if I ruin everything? What if people are shocked, say horrible things? Let me tell you something, Dorothy smiled. I've worked for wealthy families my whole life, seen many elegant, educated women with all the privileges money can buy. And you know what I learned? True class doesn't come from expensive dresses or famous last names. It comes from kindness, how you treat people, especially those who can't do anything for you. Sarah nodded slowly, absorbing the words. And if there's one thing I can say about you, Dorothy continued, it's that you have more natural class in your pinky finger than most of those socialites have in their whole bodies. For the first time since the night before, Sarah felt a flicker of something that could only be called courage. But still, her voice faltered. Then she took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. I'm still scared. Dorothy squeezed her hand gently. Then go scared, honey. Sometimes the best decisions in life come when the heart is still shaking. Sarah nodded, feeling a quiet strength growing inside her. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah nervously walked the aisles of Macy's on the Magnificent Mile, her eyes scanning racks of dresses with a growing anxiety twisting her stomach. Every price tag she saw felt like a cruel reminder of the gap between her world and the event she was preparing for. Can I help you? A saleswoman approached, her expression professional but slightly condescending as she sized up Sarah's simple clothes, faded jeans and a cotton blouse that had cost $15 on clearance. I'm looking for a dress, Sarah murmured, her cheeks warming. For a formal event. What kind of event? The saleswoman, whose name tag read Jennifer, kept a practiced smile as she already calculated how much Sarah might have to spend. A charity gala. Jennifer raised her eyebrows in surprise. Oh, well, we have some dresses on sale that might work. Sarah followed Jennifer to a more tucked-away section of the store, where the dresses were visibly simpler, less elaborate than the ones she'd seen at the entrance. Each cost between $80 and $150, a sum that would usually make her hesitate for weeks before purchasing, but now felt like her only viable option. She tried on 6 different dresses, each one leaving her more discouraged than the last. Too simple, too casual, too inappropriate for a world of champagne and conversations about art investments. Then she saw the navy blue dress. Hanging almost hidden among other styles, the dress had a classic cut that fell just below the knees, 3/4 sleeves, and an elegant but conservative neckline. The fabric was simple crepe, without sparkles or fancy embroidery, but it had a quiet elegance that sparked something inside Sarah's chest. That one? She said, pointing. Jennifer followed her gaze and frowned slightly. That's too plain for a gala, don't you think? We have options with more presence. But when Sarah tried it on, something shifted. The dress fit her perfectly, flattering her figure without drama. In the mirror, she no longer saw the insecure Nanny, but a woman who might, just maybe, belong in that world for one night. How much is it? She asked, already knowing she would buy it regardless of the answer. $125, but it's 20% off. $100. Sarah took a deep breath. It was almost a third of what was left from her paycheck after essential expenses. But when she looked in the mirror again, she knew she had no choice. I'll take it. While Sarah made her modest purchases, just a few miles away at the prestigious Chicago Club in the Gold Coast, Victoria Ashford savored her afternoon martini with the pleasure of someone about to share particularly juicy information. T34. Victoria was everything Chicago society expected from a socialite. Platinum blonde with perfectly curled hair, always dressed in clothes costing more than most people earned in 6 months, and blessed with the kind of classic beauty that photographed beautifully on social pages. More importantly, Victoria had history with Thomas Mitchell. 3 years earlier, shortly after Catherine had died, Victoria had made what she considered a discreet but determined approach. Casual dinners, invitations to events, talks about how he needed to move on, and how she would be there to support him. For a few months, it seemed her strategies were working. Thomas had accepted some invitations, even accompanied her to 2 social events. But then, suddenly, he withdrew completely, retreating again into his self-imposed isolation, and Victoria never fully got over the feeling that something or someone had interfered with her carefully laid plans. Amanda, dear. Victoria leaned toward Amanda Sterling, wife of banker Robert Sterling. Have you heard anything about who Thomas is bringing to the gala on Saturday? Amanda Sterling, an elegant woman in her early 40s with perfectly styled brown hair, paused with her wine glass halfway to her lips. No official word, she replied cautiously. Amanda had learned over the years to navigate the treacherous waters of high society gossip with extreme care. Why do you ask? Because, Victoria lowered her voice conspiratorially, my source at Mitchell and Associates told me he made a very unusual choice. Unusual how? Priscilla Morrison leaned closer to the table. Priscilla, wife of public prosecutor Harold Morrison, had a well-earned reputation for knowing about every scandal in town before it became public. Victoria smiled with a look that didn't reach her eyes. Well, apparently it's none of us. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. The 3 women exchanged looks, processing the implications. You mean someone outside our circle? Amanda asked delicately. Far outside, Victoria confirmed, clearly savoring every word. Actually, completely outside. Priscilla leaned even closer. Victoria, stop beating around the bush and just spill it. Victoria paused dramatically, taking a sip of her martini before dropping the bomb. The nanny. The silence that followed was so complete it could have been cut with a knife. Amanda almost choked on her wine, and Priscilla's mouth literally hung open. The nanny, Amanda repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. Sarah something. Johnson, I think. Victoria waved a dismissive hand, as if the last name was irrelevant. A completely ordinary person. No education, no pedigree. Absolutely nothing that justifies being at that event. Priscilla shook her head slowly. That can't be right. Thomas is many things, but he's not stupid. He knows this would be, well, it would be social suicide. That's exactly why it's so fascinating. Victoria smiled maliciously. Either he's lost his mind completely, or there's something going on that we don't understand. Amanda placed her glass down harder than necessary. Well, whatever's going on, this is going to be interesting to watch. That same afternoon, in Robert Sterling's office atop the Sterling Financial Building, the conversation was more reserved but no less speculative. Robert, said Harrison Reynolds, entering the office with a Cuban cigar between his fingers. Have you heard the rumors about Thomas and the gala? Robert Sterling looked up from the documents he was reviewing. At 57, Robert was a man who had built his financial empire with patience and strategy, and he had learned to pay attention when rumors started circulating about important city figures. What rumors? He asked, motioning for Harrison to sit in the leather chair across his desk. Apparently, he's bringing the maid. Robert frowned. Maid? The kid's nanny. A completely unknown woman. Harrison lit the cigar, eyebrows rising with amusement. Amanda is positively scandalized. Robert leaned back in his chair, processing the information. As a banker, he had learned to assess risks, and this definitely looked risky. That's unexpected, he said finally. Thomas has always been extremely careful about his public image. Exactly why this is so intriguing. Harrison blew out a puff of smoke. Either he's having some kind of nervous breakdown, or there's more to this story than it seems. Robert drummed his fingers on the desk, his mind already calculating possible repercussions. Thomas was more than a colleague. Their business partnerships were several, and Thomas's reputation directly affected some of Robert's investments. How did you hear about this? He asked. Margaret Stone mentioned it to my secretary during a call about other matters. Apparently, she's worried. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Margaret Stone was known for absolute discretion, so if she was commenting on the situation, even indirectly, it meant she was genuinely alarmed. Well, he said at last, this should be interesting to watch unfold. On Friday night, Sarah sat in front of the small mirror in her bedroom at the apartment she shared with her college roommate Jessica, trying to work some magic with the limited makeup products she owned. I can't believe you're really doing this, Jessica said from the foot of the bed. Jessica worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital and had been Sarah's confidant through all the emotional chaos of the last few days. Me neither, Sarah murmured, carefully applying some mascara. Her hands trembled slightly, and she had to stop twice to take deep breaths. Are you nervous? Sarah gave a humorless laugh. Nervous?
Jess, I'm terrified.
This is probably the biggest mistake of my life. Or, Jessica sat on the bed. It could be the best thing that's ever happened to you. Sarah paused, the blush brush suspended midair. How do you figure? Sarah, are you blind? This man is clearly interested in you. Men like Thomas Mitchell don't invite nannies to charity galas just out of kindness. They do it because they want the company of that specific person. He probably just needed someone, and I was convenient, Sarah snapped back, but her voice lacked conviction. Right? That's why he could have called any one of 1,000 socialites who would have been desperate to go with him. Jessica rolled her eyes. Sarah, the man is interested in you as a woman, not as an employee. Sarah's heart raced at those words. It was something she had started to suspect, but hearing someone else say it out loud made the possibility feel too real, too frightening. What if I don't fit in? What if I say something stupid, or use the wrong fork, or... Then you learn. Jessica stood and went to Sarah's closet. Can I see the dress again? Sarah pointed to where the navy dress hung, carefully protected by a plastic bag. Jessica examined it critically. It's perfect, she said at last. Elegant without trying too hard. Sophisticated but not pretentious. You made a good choice. You really think so? I'm sure. And with your hair down and a little makeup, you'll look stunning. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror again. She'd decided to leave her light brown hair down, naturally wavy, instead of attempting an elaborate style that would probably fall apart during the night. The makeup was subtle. Some foundation, mascara to highlight her green eyes, and a soft pink lipstick. Jess, she said suddenly, what if the other people there are terrible to me? What if they look at me like I don't belong? Jessica grabbed Sarah's shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. Then you hold your head high and remember you have as much right to be there as any of them. You're smart, kind, genuine, qualities half of those people probably don't even know the meaning of. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling a spark of determination ignite inside her. Besides, Jessica smiled mischievously, you'll be on the arm of the most eligible man in Chicago. Let them be jealous. On Saturday afternoon, Sarah stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, wearing the navy dress and a pair of black low-heeled shoes she'd borrowed from Jessica. She looked herself up and down, trying to see herself through the eyes of the people she would meet that night. The dress looked good, she had to admit. The fabric draped smoothly over her curves, and the color brought out her eyes. Her hair shone in the light, and the subtle makeup highlighted her best features without looking overdone. She didn't look like a socialite, and she never would, but she looked like a polished, more confident version of herself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas, imagining how he might be at that moment. Probably in his master suite, adjusting a tie that cost more than her monthly rent, preparing for a world where he felt completely at ease. And her? She was getting ready to leap into an abyss, not knowing if there would be a safety net to break her fall. Sarah took a deep breath, looking herself in the eye through the mirror. Dorothy was right. She just needed to be herself. And if that wasn't enough for that world, at least it would be real. You can do this? She whispered to her reflection, trying to inject more courage into her voice than she really felt. For one night, you can be part of that world. But even as she spoke the words, part of her wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life, or have the most important night she'd ever imagined possible. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the small apartment at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, and Sarah felt her stomach flip violently. Jessica ran to the window, pulling back the curtains to peer down at the street below. "Oh my God," she whispered. "There's a huge black limousine, and a driver in uniform is getting out of the car." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to calm the nerves that felt like electricity under her skin. "I can't do this, Jess. I just can't." "Yes, you can." Jessica held her hands firmly. "Take a deep breath. You look beautiful. You're ready. You deserve to be there." The doorbell rang again, and this time Sarah managed to walk to the door with legs that felt like jelly. When she opened it, Thomas Mitchell was standing in the modest hallway outside, and for a moment she completely forgot how to breathe. He was stunningly elegant in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that highlighted his athletic build. His bow tie was flawless, his shoes shined like mirrors, and there was something about his presence that seemed to fill the entire space around him. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's heart race. There was an intensity there, a genuine admiration that made her feel both exposed and protected at the same time. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of reverent surprise that made her cheeks warm. "You're breathtaking." For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. Thomas had imagined what she would look like dressed up for the occasion, but reality far exceeded his expectations. There was a natural elegance in Sarah that no amount of money could buy, the way she carried herself, the shy but determined sparkle in her green eyes, the simple dress that enhanced her beauty without any showiness. "Thank you," Sarah murmured, aware she was probably blushing like a teenager. Well, you always look sharp." Thomas smiled, and there was something different in that smile, warmer, more intimate than any expression he had shown during all the months of their strictly professional relationship. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. Sarah took a deep breath, grabbed her small black purse, the only one she owned that could even remotely pass for the occasion, and placed her hand on his arm. "Ready?" she lied convincingly. Walking down the building stairs was like moving through a dream. Thomas adjusted his pace to match hers, mindful of the low heels she wore, a practical choice he secretly admired. When they reached the street, the driver had already opened the limousine door, and Sarah had to fight the urge to look around to see if any neighbors were watching. The limousine's interior was all quiet luxury, soft leather that smelled expensive, gentle lights, and a feeling of isolation from the outside world that was both comforting and intimidating. "Nervous?" Thomas asked gently as the limousine glided through the streets of Chicago. Sarah let out a shaky laugh. "Terrified is a more accurate description. You don't have to be." He turned fully to face her. "Sarah, I know this might seem like a different world, but at the end of the day, these are just people. People who are, most of the time, a lot less interesting and genuine than you." There was something in the way he said that, a touch of disdain for the people in his own social circle, that made Sarah wonder if he really felt as comfortable in that world as he appeared. "What if I say something wrong? What if I don't know which fork to use or—" "Sarah." Thomas's voice was firm but kind. "You've spent 2 years taking care of the most precious children in my life. You know how to be graceful under pressure, how to make others feel at ease, how to be genuinely kind. Those qualities are far more valuable than knowing outdated social protocols." His words sent warmth through Sarah's chest, but they also awakened something deeper, a growing awareness that the feelings between them had evolved far beyond the employer-employee relationship. The Palmer House Hotel rose before them like a fairy tale palace, its historic facade lit by thousands of lights that made the building sparkle against Chicago's night sky. Luxury cars lined up at the entrance, unloading passengers in shimmering gowns and impeccable tuxedos. Discreet photographers captured key arrivals, and a red carpet literally stretched from the sidewalk to the main entrance. When the limousine stopped, Sarah felt her courage flicker like a candle in the wind. "I don't belong here," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. But he heard her, and before she could protest, he took her hand. "You belong by my side," he said, and there was such conviction in his voice that for a moment she almost believed it. The driver opened the door, and Thomas stepped out first, extending his hand to help her. The moment her feet touched the red carpet, Sarah felt like she had entered a completely different world, a world of casual opulence and innate privilege that seemed as far from her reality as the surface of the moon. The Palmer House lobby was a symphony of marble and gold, with crystal chandeliers projecting rainbows across ornate walls. Women glided through the space in dresses Sarah instinctively knew cost more than she made in a year, their jewelry capturing and reflecting light like tiny suns. Men in tuxedos chatted in small groups, their voices carrying the casual confidence that comes from never worrying about bills or budgets. "It's impressive," Sarah murmured, her eyes sweeping the hand-painted ceiling. "Wait until you see the main ballroom," Thomas replied, pride in his voice, pride in showing this world to her. They walked toward the elevators, and Sarah was aware they were drawing stairs. At first, she thought it was normal. Thomas Mitchell was a well-known figure. People surely always noticed him at public events. But gradually, she began to realize the looks lingered. Whispers followed in their wake, and a growing sense of discomfort settled in her stomach. In the elevator, as they rode up to the 23rd floor where the gala was being held, Thomas seemed completely at ease, checking messages on his phone or adjusting his tuxedo cuffs. Sarah, on the other hand, felt like every fiber of her being vibrated with nerves. "Thomas," she said hesitantly, "people are staring." He looked up from his phone and smiled. "They always do. You'll get used to it." But Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to get used to it. There was something about those looks that wasn't the usual admiration. There was curiosity, yes, but also something sharper, more calculating. The elevator doors opened to reveal an elegantly decorated hallway leading to the double doors of the grand ballroom. Even from a distance, Sarah could hear the murmur of conversations, the clink of crystal, and the soft music of a string quartet. "Ready?" Thomas asked, offering his arm again. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to summon all the courage she could. "Ready." They walked down the hall, and when they reached the ballroom doors, Thomas gave a nod to the doormen, who opened them simultaneously as if for a theatrical entrance. The grand ballroom was absolutely spectacular. The ceiling was a work of art in itself, painted with classical scenes and lit by 3 huge crystal chandeliers that looked like cascades of diamonds. Round tables were elegantly set throughout the room, each decorated with elaborate floral arrangements and crystals that reflected light like tiny prisms. A marble dance floor occupied the center of the room, surrounded by a stage where musicians played gently. But it was the crowd's reaction that made Sarah's stomach drop. The moment they entered, Thomas confident and elegant, Sarah trying to keep her posture straight despite her nerves. A wave of silence spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze in the air, and Sarah had the distinct feeling that every person in the room had turned to look directly at her. Thomas, seemingly unaware of the effect of their entrance, casually waved to acquaintances as he guided her through the ballroom. But Sarah was painfully aware of every stare, every whisper, every barely disguised expression of surprise. "Who is that?" she heard someone murmur. "I've never seen her before. She must be someone important to be with Thomas Mitchell. That dress. Where did she get that?" Victoria Ashford stood near the bar, surrounded by her usual circle of perfectly dressed socialites, and her eyes narrowed dangerously as Thomas and Sarah walked past. Well, she murmured to Amanda Sterling, who stood beside her. "Looks like the rumors were true." Amanda nearly choked on her champagne. "Is that really the nanny? The one and only?" Victoria replied, her voice dripping with scorn. "Look at that dress. I bet it cost less than my silk stockings." Priscilla Morrison joined the group, her eyes shining with malicious gossip. "She looks like a secretary dressing for a job interview. At least a secretary would have the decency to know she doesn't belong here," Victoria added, taking a long sip of champagne. "It's almost pathetic, really. The way she's clinging to his arm, clearly terrified." The 3 women laughed discreetly, but not so discreetly that their cruelty wasn't palpable to anyone close enough to hear. "Suppose she even knows which utensils to use," Amanda added, her own insecurity masked by cruelty. "Oh, darlings," Victoria smiled maliciously as she watched Sarah try to navigate the greetings and introductions Thomas was making. "This promises to be a lot more entertaining than I expected tonight." Sarah felt the looks like tiny needles on her skin. Every introduction Thomas made, "This is Sarah Johnson," was followed by a tiny but noticeable pause, a moment of evaluation where she could practically see people trying to decipher her social standing, her relevance, her right to be there. "How do you know Thomas?" asked an elegant woman with perfectly styled gray hair and jewelry that probably cost more than the house Sarah grew up in. I work for him," Sarah answered honestly, immediately realizing her mistake when the woman's expression shifted subtly. "Oh." The response came with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. "How interesting." Thomas was engaged in a conversation about financial markets with two older men, and Sarah found herself momentarily alone, standing on the edge of the conversation, feeling like an intruder who had been found out. That's when she noticed the whispers. They came from all directions, fragments of conversation reaching her ears like little cruelties. "Definitely not from our circle. That dress is clearly from a department store. He must be going through some kind of crisis. She barely knows how to hold a champagne glass." Sarah looked down at her own hand, realizing she was indeed holding the glass awkwardly, her nervous fingers making it tremble slightly. "Sarah." Thomas's voice brought her back to the present. "Would you like something from the bar?" She nodded, unable to trust her voice, and as he walked away to get their drinks, she found herself completely exposed in the middle of the elegant ballroom. And it was in that moment of total vulnerability that she heard Victoria Ashford speak, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard. "Well, at least now we know why Thomas hasn't been going out lately. Apparently he's been occupied with the help." The laughter that followed was low and musical, but to Sarah, it sounded like shattering glass. She stood there, in the middle of the most elegant ballroom she had ever seen, wearing her best dress and trying her hardest to belong, and for the first time, she fully understood the magnitude of her mistake. She didn't belong here, and everyone in the room knew it. The sound of the crystal bell echoed through the grand ballroom, signaling that it was time for everyone to take their seats. Sarah felt a momentary relief. At least sitting down, she would feel less exposed to constant stares. Thomas returned with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her with a smile that seemed forced. "Our table is number 3, he said softly, gently placing his hand on her back to guide her. "Right up there in the front." Of course it would be in the front, Sarah thought, a mix of pride and terror swirling inside her. The head table, where all eyes would be focused throughout the meal as they approached the elegantly set round table, decorated with more utensils than Sarah had ever seen together. She noticed who her tablemates would be. Robert Sterling was already seated, adjusting Amanda beside him. Nearby, Harold Morrison, the district attorney, spoke quietly with his wife, Priscilla. And directly across from her, as if fate were conspiring against her, Victoria Ashford was being courteously seated by the evening's companion, an older man Sarah did not recognize. "Thomas." Robert Sterling stood, his smile unable to fully mask his curiosity. "Good to see you here. And this must be the young lady we've heard so much about." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as all the eyes at the table turned to her. Thomas pulled out her chair with a gallant gesture that, under normal circumstances, would have made her feel special, but now only intensified the sensation of being watched. "Robert." "Amanda," Thomas greeted calmly. "I'd like you to meet Sarah Johnson." "Sarah?" "Robert Sterling of Sterling Financial, and his wife, Amanda." "It's nice to meet you," Sarah said, reaching out her hand and trying to keep her voice steady. Robert's handshake lasted longer than necessary, his eyes appraising her as if she were a risky investment. "The pleasure is ours," Robert responded, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah suspect he already knew exactly who she was. "So tell me, Sarah, how do you know our Thomas?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah felt everyone at the table waiting for her answer. She glanced quickly at Thomas, who nodded almost imperceptibly, encouraging her to be honest. "I work for Mr. Mitchell," she answered with dignity. "I've cared for Emma and Daniel for almost 2 years." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Sarah saw Amanda exchange a look with Priscilla, and Victoria took a sip of champagne that seemed more an attempt to hide a malicious smirk than quench thirst. "How dedicated of Thomas," Victoria finally remarked, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. To invite people from his domestic staff to events like this. Very democratic. Thomas visibly stiffened. Sarah is much more than an employee, Victoria. She's part of the family. Of course she is. Victoria smiled, but her eyes remained cold. What a modern arrangement. Harold Morrison, trying to break the growing tension, leaned forward. Sarah, you must have some interesting stories about the Mitchell children's mischief. How old is Emma now? 7, Sarah answered, grateful for a genuine question. And Daniel is 5. They are wonderful kids. I'm sure they are, Amanda commented, but there was a condescending tone in her voice. It must be rewarding to work with children when you have minimal education and few other options. The casual cruelty of the remark hit Sarah like a punch in the gut. She felt Thomas tense beside her, his hand moving as if to take hers but stopping halfway. Actually, Sarah said calmly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice, I graduated with a degree in English literature from Northwestern University. I chose to work with children, not because I lacked options. The table fell silent again, and Sarah saw a flicker of respect in Harold Morrison's eyes. Even Robert seemed slightly impressed. The first courses were served by waiters moving with the precision of dancers, and Sarah found herself discreetly watching how others handled the multiple forks and knives. Luckily, she had seen enough movies to know you start from the outside and work your way in, but each movement still felt fraught with potential embarrassment. Sarah? Robert Sterling said casually, cutting his smoked salmon. Where are you originally from? Rockford, she answered honestly, knowing that lying would only cause more trouble.
Ah, Rockford.
He nodded as if that explained everything. And your parents? What do they do for a living? Sarah felt her throat tighten. It was a simple question, but she knew exactly where it was headed. My dad worked in a factory. My mom was a hairdresser. Worked? Robert raised his eyebrows. He died when I was 16.
A workplace accident.
The discomfort at the table was now palpable. Thomas discreetly placed his hand over Sarah's under the table, a small but significant gesture of support. I'm sorry for your loss, Harold Morrison said sincerely, and Sarah was grateful for his honesty. It must have been tough, Amanda added, and for a moment Sarah thought she detected genuine sympathy. Paying for college with such limited resources. And there it was, another barb disguised as compassion. I worked a lot during college, Sarah replied calmly. Waitressing, cleaning, anything that paid. And I had academic scholarships. How admirable, Victoria commented, but her voice suggested anything but admiration. It must have been a very enlightening experience, mixing with people from different social levels. Thomas had clearly reached his limit. Victoria, his voice carried a warning tone Sarah had never heard before. Maybe we could discuss something more appropriate for the occasion. Oh, of course, Victoria laughed lightly, though I find it fascinating how circumstances can lead people to unexpected situations. She paused, taking another sip of champagne. For example, tonight, some might wonder whether some invitations were well thought out. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the waiters seemed to hesitate in their movements. Sarah felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the ballroom. Victoria's criticism was not directed at her outright, but everyone at the table, and probably nearby, understood perfectly who she meant. Thomas put his fork on the table more forcefully than necessary. Victoria, I suggest— No, Sarah interrupted softly, her voice surprisingly firm. She turned to face Victoria directly. You're right, Mrs. Ashford. Some people may question why I'm here. And do you know what I think about that? Victoria raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this direct confrontation. I think, Sarah continued, that we judge one another too quickly based on superficial appearances. I may not have grown up privileged, but I learned values that seem to be in short supply in some privileged circles. Values like kindness, genuine compassion, and the ability to see a person's worth beyond their bank account. The table was so silent they could hear conversations from the neighboring tables. Victoria had lost her condescending smile, replaced by a barely concealed look of shock. Even Robert Sterling seemed impressed by Sarah's eloquent response. Besides, Sarah added, her voice calm but determined, Mr. Mitchell invited me because he values my company and character. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe they should examine why they feel so threatened by the presence of someone different. Thomas watched her with something that could have been pride mixed with admiration. Harold Morrison was clearly struggling not to smile openly. The rest of the dinner passed in a tense atmosphere. Victoria had withdrawn into whispered conversations with Amanda, occasionally casting sharp glances at Sarah. Robert Sterling, surprisingly, began asking more respectful questions about Sarah's experience at Northwestern, discovering they had mutual acquaintances in the literature department. But Sarah could feel the gazes from other tables. People discreetly pointed in her direction, whispering behind wine glasses. She caught fragments of conversations. Did you hear what she said to Victoria Ashford? She's got guts. I'll give her that. Thomas must be mortified. Never seen anything like this at an event of this caliber. When the main courses were served, Sarah realized she had barely touched her food. Her stomach was too tied up in knots to truly enjoy what was probably a $200 per person meal. Thomas seemed equally uncomfortable, though he maintained polite conversations with Harold Morrison about local politics. Sarah, Priscilla Morrison leaned toward her. You mentioned English literature. What was your thesis about? Sarah was grateful for a genuine question. I wrote about the representation of working women in Victorian fiction. Specifically, how authors like Elizabeth Gaskell challenged social norms through their female protagonists. Fascinating, Harold Morrison commented, and he seemed sincere. Gaskell was a remarkable writer, very ahead of her time on social issues. For a few minutes, the conversation flowed naturally about literature and social history. Sarah finally felt herself relax, speaking about something she genuinely loved. She noticed Thomas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Admiration, certainly, but something deeper too. But the truce was temporary. When dessert was served, Victoria decided to make a comment loud enough to be heard by nearby tables. It's so refreshing, she said with fake enthusiasm, when events like this remind us of the importance of charity. After all, we all need to do our part to lift up those less fortunate. The double meaning was unmistakable. Sarah felt her cheeks burn but kept her posture straight. Thomas had clearly had enough. Victoria, your constant need to put others down says more about your own character than anyone you choose to attack. I never attack anyone, Victoria replied with feigned innocence. I was simply commenting on the charitable nature of the event. We all know exactly what you were commenting on, Thomas fired back, his voice low but loaded with restrained irritation. The tension at the table had become nearly unbearable when an elegant middle-aged woman stepped onto the stage, approaching the microphone. Sarah recognized her from the photos in the event programs, Catherine Brennan, president of the charitable foundation being honored that evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine's voice echoed through the ballroom, I hope you are all enjoying this wonderful evening. Before we continue with our fundraising, we would like to hear a few words from some of our most generous supporters. Sarah felt some relief knowing the attention would temporarily shift away from her table. First, Catherine continued, I would like to invite Mr. Robert Sterling from Sterling Financial, who has been a tireless supporter of our youth education programs for underprivileged children. Polite applause echoed as Robert stood, shook Amanda's hand, and walked toward the stage. Sarah watched as he climbed the steps with the confidence of someone used to addressing crowds. Robert's speech was competent if not inspiring. Statistics about needy children, the importance of educational opportunities, and thanks to other donors. Sarah found herself thinking about her own childhood, all the time she had depended on the kindness of teachers who stayed late to help with homework, or the librarian who let her stay late studying when she didn't want to go home. When Robert finished and returned to the table, Catherine returned to the microphone. Thank you, Robert, for your inspiring words. Now, I would like to invite another of our most dedicated supporters, someone who has been instrumental not only financially but also personally involved in many of our programs. Sarah felt Thomas straighten beside her, and a strange sense of anticipation began to build in her stomach. Please welcome Mr. Thomas Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell and Associates. The applause was warmer this time, and Sarah saw people at other tables turning to watch as Thomas stood. But instead of immediately heading to the stage, he paused, placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder, and leaned in to whisper in her ear. "This wasn't planned, but maybe it's exactly what we need." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Thomas had started walking toward the stage, leaving her with a growing feeling that something significant was about to happen. At the table, Victoria Ashford watched with narrowed eyes, as if sensing the control of the night's narrative was about to slip completely from her grasp. Thomas's walk to the stage seemed endless to Sarah. She watched him climb the steps with that natural confidence that had always impressed her. But there was something different in his movements, a determination that went beyond his usual professional demeanor. As he approached the microphone and adjusted its height, the murmurs filling the room gradually faded into expectant silence. "Good evening," Thomas began, his voice clear and echoing through the sound system. "Thank you, Catherine, for your generous words, and thank you all for being here tonight to support such an important cause." Sarah watched from the table, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them from trembling. Victoria leaned toward Amanda, whispering something behind her wine glass, but her eyes stayed fixed on the stage with a calculating expression. "When Catherine asked me to speak tonight," Thomas continued, "I thought about what it really means to make a difference in people's lives. We think of donations, of checks we write, of funds we establish." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But the truth is that real impact comes from something much simpler and much rarer than money." A low murmur spread through the room. This did not sound like the typical fundraising speech everyone expected. "It comes from the ability to see value where others see only surface. It comes from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it makes us unpopular. And it comes from people who, regardless of their background or circumstances, choose to live with integrity and genuine compassion." Sarah felt her heart race. There was something about the direction Thomas's speech was taking that made her suspect he wasn't reading from a prepared script. "Tonight," Thomas said, his voice gaining emotional strength, "I brought with me someone who embodies each of these values, someone who has dedicated her life to caring for the most vulnerable children, someone who has faced hardships many of us can't even imagine, and who rose from those experiences not with bitterness, but with an even greater capacity to love and serve others." The silence in the room had become absolute. People stopped sipping their drinks. They stopped shifting in their seats. They even stopped breathing audibly. Sarah felt as if the entire world had paused. "Many of you know, let me be honest. All of you have probably noticed that I brought someone tonight who is different from what you'd expect to see at an event like this." Victoria Ashford had gone completely rigid. Her glass paused halfway to her lips. Amanda Sterling looked pale, clearly realizing something monumental was happening. Even Robert, who had just returned from a casual conversation with another guest, was now fully focused on the stage. "And you are right," Thomas continued, his voice carrying a raw honesty that cut through the typical formality of these events. "Sarah Johnson didn't grow up in mansions in Highland Park. She didn't attend elite prep schools or spend summers in the Hamptons. Her father died in an industrial accident when she was a teenager, and she worked her way through college by waiting tables and cleaning offices." Sarah felt tears burn her eyes. She wanted to run, hide, disappear. Anything but be the center of attention for 300 members of Chicago's high society. "But let me tell you what Sarah really is," Thomas said, and now there was real passion in his voice, an intensity that made several people lean forward unconsciously. "She's the person who stays up all night when one of my kids has nightmares. Not because she's paid to, but because she genuinely cares about their well-being. She's the person who teaches my children not only math and reading, but compassion, integrity, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity." Thomas's voice grew more emotional, and Sarah could see he was struggling to keep his composure. "She's the person who, when her world collapsed after losing her father, didn't choose bitterness or self-pity. Instead, she chose to dedicate her life to making sure other children had the educational and loving opportunities she had to fight so hard to earn." Harold Morrison nodded slowly, and Sarah saw several others around the room do the same. But Victoria looked like she had swallowed something sour, her expression of disdain slowly shifting to something close to panic. "And tonight," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "When some people thought it was appropriate to question her presence here, when some people decided her background made her less worthy of basic respect and courtesy, Sarah responded not with anger or defensiveness, but with grace, dignity, and an eloquence that shamed those who attacked her." The silence in the room was now charged with palpable tension. Sarah felt eyes turning toward her table, specifically on Victoria, and saw the older woman shrink slightly in her chair. "So when I think about values, when I think about real charity, when I think about the kind of person who should be honored and heard, I don't think of bank accounts or family pedigrees. I think of character. I think of actions. I think of courage." Thomas paused, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the room. And at that moment, she saw something in them that made her heart stop. Not just admiration or respect, but something much deeper and more personal. "And that's why," he said, his voice now steady with absolute conviction, "today, the person who deserves to be heard is her." He extended his hand towards Sarah, and the gesture echoed through the room like both a challenge and an invitation. "Sarah Johnson, please come forward." The silence that followed was so complete Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. 300 pairs of eyes were fixed on her, and she felt as if she stood on the edge of a cliff, being invited to jump without knowing if there was a safety net waiting below. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her legs felt like concrete, her lungs forgot how to breathe, and her mind went completely blank. She saw Victoria staring at her with barely disguised horror, saw Amanda whisper something urgently to Robert, and saw Harold Morrison watching with what looked like genuine expectation. But when her eyes met Thomas's again, when she saw his full confidence in her, his absolute belief that she could not only do this, but deserve to, something inside her lit up slowly, as if coming out of a trance. Sarah pushed back her chair. The sound of the chair legs scraping the marble floor echoed through the silence like a gunshot. She stood, her legs trembling slightly, but her posture straight and determined. Step by step, she began walking toward the stage. Each movement seemed amplified, every breath audible. She could feel the weight of all those eyes, all the expectations, all the judgments, but for the first time that night, she didn't shrink under that weight. Instead, she carried it. When she reached the stage and began climbing the steps, Sarah could hear her own blood rushing through her veins. Thomas was waiting at the top, and when she got close, he smiled. Not the professional, polite smile she'd seen him use with clients and associates, but something completely genuine and warmly personal. "You've got this?" he whispered, too quietly for the microphone to pick up, but loud enough for her to hear. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice, and reached out her hand. Thomas placed the microphone in her palm, his fingers touching hers for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he stepped back, leaving her alone in the center of the stage, with 300 pairs of expectant eyes fixed on her and a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. Sarah held the microphone with both hands, looked out at the sea of faces turned toward her, and took a deep breath. It was time to speak. Sarah looked down at the microphone in her hands, feeling its weight as if it were made of lead. The silence in the hall pressed in on her from all sides, and for a terrifying moment, she wondered if she would be able to make any sound at all. Her mouth felt dry, her hands trembled slightly, and she could feel sweat forming at the base of her neck. Then she lifted her eyes and saw Thomas standing at the side of the stage, nodding encouragingly, and something inside her steadied. She began, her voice coming out as a trembling whisper that was amplified by the microphone. She paused, took a deep breath, and tried again. "I never thought I'd be speaking in a place like this." Her voice was still shaky, but now it was audible. Some people in the front row leaned forward slightly. "When Mr. Mitchell invited me tonight, I almost said no." A nervous laugh escaped her. "Actually, I did say no, twice, because I knew that I didn't belong here." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. Victoria Ashford sat rigidly in her chair, as if ready to jump up at any moment. But others seemed genuinely curious now, their earlier hostile expressions replaced by something close to respectful attention. "And you know what?" Sarah said, her voice gaining its first note of real strength. "Maybe I really don't belong here. At least, not in the way you imagine when you think about who should be in this hall at this event, wearing these dresses and drinking this champagne. Some people in the audience exchanged uncertain glances, unsure where this was headed, because I didn't grow up in Highland Park or Lincoln Park or any of the neighborhoods you probably grew up in. I grew up in Rockford, in a small 2-bedroom house my parents rented and never could afford to buy. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she forced herself to keep going. And you might be wondering why I'm telling you this, why Thomas thought you needed to hear my story. She paused, gathering courage. Because my story isn't just about me. It's about millions of kids growing up exactly where I did, facing the same challenges I faced. A subtle change swept through the hall. The restlessness had almost completely vanished, replaced by focused attention. I lost my parents when I was 10, the words coming easier than she expected. Maybe because she'd had to explain it so many times over the years. Car accident one winter night. The car slipped on the ice on Interstate 90, hit a truck. They died instantly. A low, collective sound went through the audience. Not quite a sigh, but an involuntary exhale of sympathy. In that moment, I suddenly became responsible not just for myself, but for my 2 younger siblings. Michael was 8, Sophie was 6. Her voice began to tremble again, but this time with real emotion, not just nerves. And they looked up to me, expecting me to know what to do, as if I were an adult just because I was the oldest. Sarah noticed tears in the eyes of several women in the front row. Even Harold Morrison had stopped taking mental notes and was simply listening. We didn't have family nearby, some distant cousins in other cities, an aunt who came to see us once a year at Christmas. Social services wanted to split us up, put me in one foster home and Michael and Sophie in another. But I begged and begged to let us stay together. She paused to take a sip of water from a glass that had appeared silently in her hands. Thomas had moved quietly to provide it. We found a temporary guardian, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Patterson who agreed to legally supervise us. But the real responsibility, the responsibility of putting food on the table, paying rent, making sure Michael and Sophie had clean clothes and their homework done, that responsibility was mine. Sarah could tell that now there was full attention in the hall. Even the waiters had stopped moving, frozen against the walls. So, at 10 years old, I started working. She smiled sadly. Not real jobs, of course, I was too young for that, but things like cleaning out garages for neighbors on weekends, walking dogs after school, babysitting when moms needed to go out. Thomas was watching her from the side of the stage, and Sarah could see genuine pride in his eyes. When I turned 14, I got my first real job. Cleaning at the local hospital 2 hours after school, 3 days a week. The pay was small, but steady. She paused, remembering that time. At 15, I added weekends at a restaurant. First just washing dishes, then serving tables when I proved I was reliable. Sarah's voice was completely steady now, filled not with self-pity but with a kind of quiet pride. And at 16, while most of you were probably worrying about prom and college choices, I was working 25 hours a week on top of school, managing a family budget, and helping Michael and Sophie with homework that was sometimes almost as hard as my own. Several people in the audience were visibly moved now. Sarah saw a woman in the second row discreetly wiping her eyes with a tissue. "But you know what I never stopped doing?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying an intensity that made several lean forward. "I never stopped studying, because every night after Michael and Sophie were asleep, after the laundry was done and the bills were organized, I would sit at that little kitchen table and study." She paused, letting the image form in her audience's minds. I studied by the light of an old lamp that flickered whenever the wind blew hard. I studied with books I bought used or borrowed from the library. I studied because I understood, even at 10 years old, that education wasn't a luxury I could afford. It was the only way I knew to guarantee Michael, Sophie, and I would have a future better than our past. The silence in the hall had shifted completely. It was no longer the tense silence of anticipation or judgment, but the respectful silence of people genuinely moved. And it worked. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself a genuine smile. Michael is now finishing his master's degree in engineering at the University of Illinois. Sophie graduated last year with honors in special education and works with autistic children in Rockford. Spontaneous applause started at a few tables and quickly spread through the hall. Sarah had to wait for it to die down before continuing. But I admit that when I graduated from Northwestern with my degree in English literature, many people, including some career counselors, didn't understand why I chose to work with children. Why not pursue a corporate job or go on to law school or business school, or one of the careers my degree could have opened for me? Sarah paused, her eyes scanning the crowd once again. She saw Victoria Ashford, who had gone completely silent, her earlier expression of disdain replaced by something much more complex. The answer is simple, but also very personal. Sarah gripped the microphone tighter, preparing for the hardest part of her story. I chose to work with children for a very specific reason. She paused, seeing that the entire hall hung on every word. And that reason has everything to do with a promise I made the night my parents died. A promise that changed not only the course of my life but the way I see every child I meet. The silence deepened even more, if that was possible, as 300 people waited to hear what promise a 10-year-old girl had made that was still guiding her life 16 years later. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the pain she had carried for years tighten in her throat. But there was something else. A strength that came from finally having the chance to speak the truth that had shaped her entire life. That terrible night, when Mrs. Patterson took us home from the hospital, after signing all the papers and making all the arrangements that a 10-year-old child shouldn't have to witness, Sarah began, her voice now softer, more intimate. I put Michael and Sophie to sleep in our parents' bed because they were too scared to stay alone in their own rooms. She paused, the memory so vivid she could almost smell the cinnamon her mother always used, could hear the uneven breaths of her siblings as they finally fell asleep. And when they finally slept, I sat on the floor beside the bed and made a promise. Not to God, not to my dead parents, but to Michael and Sophie. I promised they would never, ever feel abandoned again. Tears were starting to form in Sarah's eyes, but her voice stayed steady. And that same night, as I sat in that darkness listening to them breathe, I realized something that would change my whole life. She paused, her eyes finding several people in the audience who looked visibly moved. I understood that somewhere out there, other kids were feeling exactly what I was feeling at that moment. Fear, abandonment, that terrible feeling that the world isn't a safe place, and that there just aren't enough adults who truly care. Harold Morrison had taken off his glasses and was wiping them, clearly trying to hide his own tears. Several women in the front rows were openly crying now. So I made a second promise that night, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with emotion. I promised that when I grew up, I would dedicate my life to making sure no child would have to go through the pain and abandonment I lived through. That I would be the caring, constant, loving presence I wished my parents could have been for me if they'd had the chance. Sarah spotted Thomas at the side of the stage, and the expression on his face. Pride, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart leap, gave her the courage to keep going. And that's why when we care for Emma and Lucas, it's not just a job for me. Her voice began to tremble with real emotion. Every time Emma wakes from a nightmare and needs someone to sit with her until she feels safe again. Every time Lucas struggles with a math lesson and needs a little extra patience. Every time any of them needs to be reminded that they are loved and valuable. I'm not just doing my job. I am keeping that promise I made when I was 10. Tears were streaming freely down Sarah's face now, but she didn't wipe them away. Instead, she let her voice carry all the emotion she had been holding back. Emma and Lucas taught me something I didn't fully understand when I was a child caring for my siblings. They taught me that family isn't just about blood. Family is showing up day after day. It's being there when someone needs you. It's loving someone not because you have to, but because you choose to. The silence in the hall had become something sacred. Even the waiters had stopped, some with tears in their eyes. When Emma asks me why her friends at school have 2 homes and she only has 1, when Lucas wants to know why his birth mother can't visit him, when they face those hard questions all kids face but that are more complicated for them, I'm not just answering as their nanny or housekeeper. I'm answering as someone who understands, viscerally and personally, what it's like to grow up feeling like your family situation is complicated. Sarah saw Victoria Ashford for the first time since she started speaking, and was shocked to see silent tears running down the older woman's face. The change in her expression was complete. All the earlier arrogance and disdain had vanished, replaced by something nearly like shame. And they love me not despite my background, but maybe in part because of it. Because when Emma is scared she's not good enough, I can honestly tell her I know how that feels, and that she can get through it. When Lucas feels different from other kids, I can tell him that being different can be his strength, not his weakness. Sarah's voice was full of passion now, and she saw that she had captured not just the attention but the hearts of her audience. So when some people question whether I belong in places like this, whether I have the right qualifications or the right background to care for children from successful families, she paused, letting her words sink into the room. I want them to understand something fundamental. Sarah lifted the microphone slightly, her posture becoming straighter, stronger. Dignity doesn't come from your parents' bank account or the neighborhood you grew up in. It comes from how you treat people when no one's looking. It comes from your ability to love without expecting anything in return. And it comes from the courage to get up every day and choose to do the work that matters, even when that work isn't glamorous or well-paid or recognized by people in places like this. Applause started spontaneously at some tables, but Sarah gently raised her hand to signal she wasn't finished yet. True love, the kind of love that changes lives, that heals wounds, that builds strong and compassionate people, that love can't be bought. It's not inherited. It doesn't come with degrees or titles or invitations to charity events. Her voice was now filled with absolute conviction. It comes from people who choose every day to put someone else's needs ahead of their own. And that's something anyone can do, no matter where they started in life. Sarah paused one final time, her eyes sweeping over the room once more. She saw Harold Morrison nodding approvingly, Amanda Sterling discreetly wiping her eyes, even some of the more conservative guests looking genuinely moved. And she saw Victoria Ashford looking at her with an expression completely different from anything shown earlier, one of genuine respect and, perhaps, regret. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, "for giving me the chance to share this with you." The silence that followed was thick as velvet, heavy with emotion and reflection. Sarah walked slowly to where Thomas was waiting, each step slow and deliberate. When she handed him the microphone, their hands touched again, and this time she saw in his eyes not just admiration or pride, but something much deeper and more personal. Thomas took the microphone, but for a long moment neither of them moved, standing silently on stage as the 300 guests processed what they had just heard. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. The silence of people who knew they had witnessed something rare and transformative. Thomas took the microphone from Sarah's hands, but for several seconds he simply held it, looking at her with an intensity that made Sarah feel like time had stopped. The silence in the hall was absolute. 300 people collectively held their breath, sensing something more was about to happen. When Thomas finally brought the microphone to his lips, his voice came out hoarse with emotion. I need to say something." He paused, clearly struggling with his own feelings. Because after hearing Sarah speak so courageously about her life, about her promises, about why she does what she does, you deserve to know the full truth about why I brought her here tonight. Sarah felt her stomach twist. What was he doing? They hadn't planned this. Sarah said she's the nanny for my kids, and technically that's true. Thomas looked directly at Sarah for a moment before turning his attention back to the audience. But that's not even close to the whole story. He took a deep breath, and Sarah could see his hands were trembling slightly. "When my wife died 2 years ago, our house died with her." His voice cracked slightly on the word, died. Emma and Lucas weren't just grieving kids. They were haunted children. They moved through the house like little ghosts, whispering where they used to laugh, avoiding the rooms where they'd played with their mother. The audience was absolutely still, captured by the raw vulnerability in Thomas's voice. "And I wasn't any better. I worked 16-hour days because I couldn't stand coming home. When I was home, I wandered from room to room, seeing reminders of Margaret everywhere, unable to connect with my own children because my own pain was too great." Sarah felt tears start to form again. hearing Thomas voice what she had witnessed but he had never said aloud before. We went through 3 nannies in 6 months. All qualified, all well recommended, all unable to break through the walls we'd built around ourselves. Thomas paused, his eyes finding Sarah again. And then Sarah came, his voice softened, taking on an almost reverent quality. In the first week she was with us, I heard Emma laugh. Truly laugh. Not the forced, polite laugh that had been all she could manage since her mother's death, but the genuine, joyful laughter of a 7-year-old child. Thomas had to stop for a moment, overcome with emotion. And when I went to see what was happening, I found Emma and Sarah building a fort with pillows in the living room. The same living room where Margaret used to read to the children. The same room we'd all avoided for months. Many people in the audience were openly crying now, moved by the image of a little girl rediscovering joy. Sarah didn't just bring Emma back to life. She brought Lucas back too. This boy who had stopped asking questions, who had become silent and withdrawn, suddenly was talking plenty again, asking endless questions about how things work, why things are the way they are. All the wonderful and exhausting questions a 5-year-old should ask. Thomas looked directly at Sarah, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. But more than that, she brought me back too, because Sarah didn't just take care of my kids. She showed me how to be their dad again. She taught me that it's possible to honor Margaret's memory, not by avoiding the places and activities that reminded us of her, but by creating new memories that can exist alongside the old ones. Thomas's voice was growing stronger now, charged with a passion that made the audience lean forward. She taught Emma it's okay to miss mommy and still be happy. She taught Lucas that asking about mommy didn't make daddy sad. Actually, it made him happy to remember. And she taught me that my kids didn't need a perfect father, they needed a present one. Sarah was now openly crying, completely moved by Thomas's raw honesty. So when you look at Sarah and see just a nanny, Thomas said, his voice gaining a strength that echoed through the hall, you are looking at the woman who saved my family. You are looking at someone who brought love back to a house that had forgotten how to feel it. You are looking at someone who is not just my children's nanny. He paused, his eyes locked on Sarah's. She is the heart that taught my family how to feel again. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before exploding into applause. But this was not the polite clapping of a charity event. These were visceral, emotional ovations coming from the depths of people's hearts who had been genuinely touched. The entire audience rose as one. Harold Morrison was clapping vigorously, tears streaming down his face. Amanda Sterling was standing on her chair, applauding with her hands above her head. Even the waitstaff lining the walls were applauding. But it was Victoria Ashford who surprised Sarah the most. The older woman had stood and was walking determinedly toward the stage, her own tears shining in the ballroom light. The applause continued, a standing ovation that seemed endless, as Victoria climbed the steps to the stage. When Victoria reached Sarah, she paused for a moment, clearly struggling with her own emotions. Then, in a voice amplified by the microphone Thomas still held, she spoke. Sarah, Victoria began, her voice trembling slightly, I owe an apology, not only to you, but to everyone in this room who witnessed my behavior tonight. The applause gradually died down as people realized Victoria was trying to speak. I came here tonight with judgments already made, with prejudices I didn't even recognize I had. Victoria looked directly into Sarah's eyes. I saw your clothes, heard about where you work, and immediately decided you didn't belong in our circle. And I was completely, shamefully wrong. Victoria reached out her hands to Sarah, who hesitated only briefly before taking them. You belong not only in this hall but anywhere people of character and compassion gather. And I would be honored if you'd forgive my ignorance and allow me to learn from your example. The applause restarted, louder and more enthusiastic than before. Sarah, still holding Victoria's hands, nodded through her tears. Of course I forgive you, Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the applause. But Victoria read her lips and smiled through her own tears. Others began moving toward the stage. Harold Morrison was one of the first, followed by Amanda Sterling and several other guests. Everyone wanted to greet Sarah, apologize if they had misjudged her, or simply express admiration for what they had just witnessed. Amid the commotion, the event organizer made his way to the microphone. Robert Chen, president of the Chicago Children's Foundation, had been observing from the back of the hall with a growing expression of admiration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "In 30 years of organizing charity events, I've never witnessed anything like what we've just heard tonight." The hall gradually quieted as people turned their attention back to the stage. The purpose of this evening was to recognize those who make a significant difference in the lives of children in our community. We plan to honor individuals and organizations whose work exemplifies the values for which our foundation exists. Robert paused, looking directly at Sarah. "But tonight, we discovered the person who most embodies those values was not on our original list of honorees. In fact, she nearly wasn't here at all." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. "It is with great pleasure and humility that I announce Sarah Martinez as our Person of the Year, not only for the extraordinary care she provides the children in her charge, but for the example she sets for all of us about what it truly means to serve others with love and dedication." The applause this time was deafening. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who, just an hour earlier, had questioned her presence. Now they were offering genuine congratulations, business cards, invitations to other events, and, most importantly, sincere respect. Thomas had moved to her side during the whole commotion, and when she looked at him amid the flood of congratulations, he leaned close to her ear. "I knew they'd understand," he whispered. "Once they knew who you really are." Sarah looked around the hall, at Victoria, now animatedly talking with other guests about the importance of re-examining our prejudices. At Harold Morrison, furiously jotting notes in a small notebook and murmuring something about a story that needs to be told. At all the people who had completely changed their perception of her in just 1 hour. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly seen. Not just for who she was, but for who she had always been. The glass doors of the Palmer House Hotel slid open with a soft whisper, releasing Sarah and Thomas into the cool Chicago night. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. The same woman who had hesitated at those very doors 2 hours earlier, questioning if she belonged in that world, was now walking beside Thomas with her head held high, her steps firm and confident. The transformation wasn't just in her posture. There was something different in her eyes, a light that hadn't been there when they arrived. People in the hotel lobby turned to watch her pass, some still recognizing her from the event, others simply sensing the aura of quiet dignity now radiating from her. "Sarah," Thomas said as they walked toward the car, "there's something else I need to tell you." She looked at him, an eyebrow raised in curiosity. After all the surprises of the night, she could barely imagine what else could be coming. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her completely. The streetlights cast soft shadows across his face, and Sarah could see he was nervous about what he was about to say. "In the past few weeks, since I decided to bring you here tonight, I've been working on something with my lawyers and accountants." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure I could make it work. But after what happened tonight, I know this is the right thing." Sarah felt her heart quicken. The expression on Thomas's face was serious, but there was also an uncontained excitement. "I'm starting an educational foundation. A foundation dedicated specifically to helping young people who grew up in the foster care system get higher education and job training." His voice quickened as his enthusiasm grew. "Not just money for tuition, but real mentoring, emotional support, help with life skills. Everything these kids need to break the cycle and build stable lives." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "And I want you to be the director," Thomas said, his voice soft but firm. "You understand these kids in a way I never could. You know what they need because you've been where they are. You can make a difference on the scale you've always wanted." For a moment, Sarah was speechless. The magnitude of what Thomas was offering, not just a job, but a platform to transform the lives of countless children like she had been, was almost impossible to grasp. "Thomas, this is incredible, but I've never run an organization." "Never?" she began. "Sarah?" Thomas gently interrupted, Tonight you stood in front of 300 of Chicago's most influential people and changed perspectives some of them had held for decades. You touched hearts, changed minds, and inspired people to reconsider their own biases. If you can do that, you can do anything. They stood there under the soft streetlight, the distant hum of Chicago traffic providing an urban soundtrack to this moment that would change everything. Besides, Thomas added with a smile, Emma and Lucas are going to need you for many more years. This foundation can be based here in Chicago, you can still be there for them, but you can also be there for hundreds of other kids who need exactly what you have to offer. Tears began to well up in Sarah's eyes again. Not tears of sadness or simple joy, but tears of recognition. The recognition that her life was about to change in ways she had never dared to imagine. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, of course I will. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was radiant. For a moment, they stood face to face under the city lights, two people whose lives had become intertwined in ways neither had anticipated when Sarah first rang the doorbell in Lincoln Park. The drive home slipped by like a dream. Sarah gazed out the window at the familiar streets of Chicago, but everything felt slightly different now. She was seeing the same city, but through eyes that had been transformed. It wasn't just that her circumstances had changed, although they certainly had. It was that her understanding of herself, her worth, her place in the world, had been fundamentally altered. When Thomas pulled into the garage of the family home, Sarah could hear sounds coming from inside. The distant noise of the TV, the babysitter Mrs. Patterson's voice talking to the kids about bedtime. Sarah? Thomas said before they got out of the car. Thank you, not just for tonight but for everything, for bringing our family back to life, for reminding me how to be a father, for showing my kids that love comes in many different forms. Sarah smiled, feeling warmth spread across her chest. Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of your lives, and for showing me tonight that I am more than I ever thought I could be. When they stepped through the front door, they were immediately greeted by joyful shouts. Sarah! Sarah! Emma came running down the hall, her bare feet softly padding on the hardwood floor. Lucas was right behind her, their faces glowing with genuine excitement. How was the fancy party? Emma asked, her wide eyes full of curiosity. Did you dance? Were there princesses? Sarah knelt down to their level, pulling them into a hug that was matched with all the enthusiasm only kids can give. It was magical, Sarah said honestly. And there were some very special people there. People who reminded me how important it is to be kind to others, no matter where they come from. Lucas stepped back a little to study her face seriously. You look different, he observed with the blunt honesty of a 5-year-old. You look happier. Sarah laughed, once again impressed by the children's insight. I think I am happier, Lucas. Sometimes good things happen when you least expect them. Mrs. Patterson appeared from the back of the house, smiling warmly. How was the event? The kids were excited for you to get back. It was extraordinary, Thomas replied, exchanging a meaningful glance with Sarah. Absolutely extraordinary. After Mrs. Patterson left and Thomas went to his office to make a few calls related to the new foundation, Sarah followed her familiar bedtime routine with Emma and Lucas. But tonight, every little ritual, brushing teeth, picking bedtime stories, checking under the bed for monsters, felt imbued with extra meaning as she tucked Emma into bed. The little girl looked at Sarah with sleepy eyes. Sarah, will you always live with us? Emma asked, her tiny voice in the darkened room. Sarah smiled, brushing Emma's hair away from her face. I'll always be in your lives, sweetheart. Always. And you know what else? I'll be able to help many other kids now too. Kids who need the same love and care that you and Lucas got. That's good, Emma mumbled, half asleep already. Everyone should have a Sarah. In the next room, Lucas was fighting sleep as usual. Sarah? He whispered as she tucked him in. What makes someone special? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was a deep question from such a little person, and after everything that had happened tonight, she felt uniquely qualified to answer. Well, Lucas, she said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. I used to think special people were those who had lots of fancy things, or lived in big houses, or appeared in magazines. Lucas nodded solemnly, taking in her words. But today I learned something different. Truly special people are the ones who use whatever they have, not matter how small, to make other people's lives better. They're people who choose to be kind even when no one is watching. They're people who see someone who needs help and decide to help, even if it's hard. Like you do, Lucas said sleepily. Sarah smiled, kissing his forehead. And like you will too, Lucas, because you have a big heart, and that's the most precious treasure there is. As Lucas finally drifted off, Sarah sat quietly in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the steady breathing of the two children who had changed her life as much as she had changed theirs. Finally, she rose silently and made her way to the hallway. Thomas was waiting for her at the top of the stairs, leaning against the banister with a thoughtful expression. "How are they?" he asked quietly. "Perfect," Sarah answered. "Absolutely perfect." They stood there for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of a house settling for the night. It was the same sound Sarah had heard hundreds of nights before, but tonight it was filled with new possibilities, new dreams, new hopes. "Sarah?" Thomas said finally, his voice low so as not to wake the children. "You realize your life will never be the same again, don't you?" Sarah nodded, thinking of all the people she had met tonight, all the opportunities that had opened, all the difference she could now make in the world. "I know," she said softly. "And for the first time in my life it doesn't scare me, because I finally understand something that took me a long time to learn." "What's that?" Sarah smiled, thinking about Victoria Ashford offering her apologies, about Harold Morrison with tears in his eyes, about the standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. "Sometimes the greatest treasures come in simple packages," she whispered, echoing the words she had just said to Lucas. "But they always come with big hearts." And with that, Sarah Martinez, former foster child, survivor, caretaker, and now director-to-be of a foundation that would change countless lives, quietly made her way to her own bedroom, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales really do come true for those brave enough to believe in themselves. The house settled into peaceful silence, holding within its walls a family that had learned to love again, and a woman who had finally learned her own worth.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.